Hey, howdy everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Imperfectly Better, a podcast documenting the real-time process of growth, learning, change, and improvement, and moving our way towards living a better life, all while still being human. I'm Cody, your friendly host, tuning in again to chat with you, the listener. If this is your first time tuning in, hello, I'm Cody. It's nice to meet you. It's nice to have you here. I hope you're having a wonderful day and that things are going good. If you're a returning listener, I hope you're also having a wonderful day and that things are going good. So, this is the second part of a 2 episode chunk that I'm doing here. So, episode 4 was all about exploring the learning difficulties that I ran into with approaching this episode and the topic of this episode. It's not required listening in order to take in this episode, but it does help to give context for why it is that my reflections, why it is that what I talk about with the Mark Manson episode on change isn't so much about what he discussed and what he and his co-host that he had on discussed in that podcast episode, or what was discussed in the follow-along, but more so the lessons and wisdom and insight shared in that episode and how it applied to my own life. That is more so what I will be discussing here, because that is how I best learn. First, I would like to talk about what it is that I am reviewing. So this is my first listener request. This was a recommendation sent to me for something to listen to, explore, and give my thoughts on. And that is the Change Solved episode from the Mark Manson Solved podcast. I will be including a link to this podcast episode in the episode description here. But if you find that the podcast episode is a little too long for you, there is a follow-along that you can get for it. And this is primarily how I took in this podcast episode. So, what did this episode talk about? So, Mark Manson and his co-host examine change through several layers. They talk about the different layers of what makes us us. So, behaviors, beliefs, and why it is that trying to change in certain areas of our life does not work, or it feels like it is extremely hard to change. So they talk about things like relatively stable traits, learned adaptations such as habits and identity, observable behaviors, different forms of the self, and the structures required to maintain change, and why it is that in many instances, not only does the change that we try to pursue fail, but how it is that the labels, identities, and beliefs that we apply to ourselves can cause us to fail in our own efforts to change. So their central argument in this episode is that people may be highly motivated to change while working on the wrong part of the problem. Now, when I give this summary, and especially as I'm talking through this podcast episode, this is not a review of it, nor is it a summary. What I am presenting here is how it is that this podcast episode and what about it resonated with me applied to my own life, and how my reflections and the questions that I answered in relation to the material that I studied for this applied to my own life. So, with that said, what was the main point or the core point that I walked away with from listening to this episode? It was that you can change by understanding what the old pattern gave you, breaking the belief that you still need it, and building a life that supports another response, a different response. So, what is the role of understanding in change? It helps to build awareness, and awareness matters. Awareness of yourself, your own cycles, your own patterns, habits, beliefs, perspectives, what makes you you, and why it is that an old identity or an old habit exists, what value it gives to you, why it exists in your life. So essentially, that awareness and understanding helps identify what a old identity or behavior is doing. It can help reveal the triggers, beliefs, unmet needs, and maintenance risks of continuing that old identity and behavior. However, with all of that said, understanding and awareness does not perform the new behavior for you. Just because you have a lot of awareness and understanding of something, it doesn't mean that you're going to automatically change. It doesn't mean that you can immediately flip a switch in your brain and become the brand new Cody. That is not what happened for me. And that is something that I will get into detail here, because there was quite a bit that I was able to connect from what I walked away from this episode with to my own life. So understanding myself helped me find the target, what I needed to change, but it did not move me toward it automatically. So the example that I would like to talk about in relation to all of this is THC. You know, the Mary Jane, the good green stuff. I used to do edibles and smoke joints quite a bit. As an autistic person, what I discovered was that that stuff worked really good for regulating my nervous system. It helped me feel as though I could downshift, and it created relief from stress and internal pressure. But it also made speaking and connection feel freer. It allowed ideas and responses from me to flow naturally. I don't want to say that it objectively regulated my nervous system, although I will say that when I've looked into the experiences of other autistic people and their experiences with THC, I've kind of found the same thing, in that THC just felt like quieting the nervous system. I used it as a way to feel calmer, looser, more open, and more able to downshift. But there came a point where I did not want to use it. I just did not want to have it in my life anymore and to have that take up time in the evenings, take up time in my life, or especially the way that I just physically, mentally, and emotionally felt, just as a result of kind of frequent usage of it. The hardest part and the hardest function to replace was not the evening relaxation. It was not the regulation of my nervous system, because I already had things that worked really well for that. I am big on meditation and visualization, and I've found a lot of success with that. What I found was hard for me was speaking freely. So often what I would do with THC is that I would have notebooks with me. I would do shadow work. I would record down and document everything that I found I was experiencing with THC. And I believed that it helped me speak authentically, stop trying to calculate a correct answer, and be able to connect dots naturally. I will say that I never used this publicly. I would always use it at home at the end of the day in private. So, never as a way to be able to have better social conversations, but it did help in my own personal reflections and work. And oftentimes that reflection would occur verbally, like having conversations with myself where I would let things flow and I would record those conversations. So then I could work through them later and I can study and explore them. I thought THC gave me the ability to flow. What it actually gave me was temporary relief from all the rules and filters I had placed on myself around flowing. So the behavior was not random or meaningless. It was performing jobs for me. But some of those jobs involved capabilities and capacities that I could eventually develop without it. Now, why didn't knowing all of this make the THC use disappear? Why didn't all of this understanding and awareness for my own cycles, habits, and patterns not cause THC to just leave my life like I wanted? The change began when I acted on the knowledge that I had. That knowledge did not remove the perceived need for it. It involved me building new habits, new routines, and new skills that rendered THC irrelevant, that I no longer needed it. So the things that I would do is practice honest and authentic speech while sober. So I took what I learned from recording my conversations while on THC and noticed how it was that I was speaking openly, speaking authentically. And I began to practice that in a sober state without the THC. I began to build that skill without the substance. I began to work through what my rules were, what my filters were, what was causing me to not be able to accept imperfect answers, imperfect responses, being able to show up in conversation with friends and groups, and being open to not being able to perfectly get a conversation right. So, the biggest and strongest evidence that I had developed the capacity to speak honestly, authentically, and in a smooth flow, that I had developed this ability sober, was through working on the podcast episodes. So, as I've said previously, I use interview style questions to guide myself. And for me, I'm not trying to perform perfectly. I'm not trying to hit things spot on. I'm just speaking honestly and following along with my notes and the actual subject that I'm trying to present. And the people who have listened to my podcast episodes so far and who have responded and given me feedback on my content are responding strongly to the authenticity and quality of the episodes. So the feedback gave me evidence that I was not merely capable of speaking naturally, I was already doing it. And in fact, I had noticed that in conversations out in public, not just with friends, but even with strangers, I found that my ability to talk and especially to connect with other people was far easier than it ever had been in the past. That evidence, that proof that I had created, weakened the old belief that I had. That now that I had that ability to speak openly, honestly, authentically, to be able to speak to my own feelings and emotions without those restrictions in the way, well, I didn't need THC. I didn't need to smoke a joint in order to do that. I could just do that sober. So that was one thing that broke the need to go back to that. Speaking of that, I do want to talk about replacing a old habit or identity versus removing the need for an old habit or identity. So, the other thing that THC had been giving me was that evening downshifting, that cooling down of my body and senses that I thought I was getting. And the interesting thing here is that I've talked about paint by the numbers in the past. And in fact, I just finished a beach portrait and canvas, which I really enjoyed doing. But paint by the numbers didn't exactly eliminate the THC. So, paint by the numbers and quiet evening routines helped replace the downshifting, but speaking naturally was not replaced with a hobby. I developed that capacity sober. And with that, it's interesting because there's two possible ways and forms of change. There is substitution, which is that another action serves enough of the same function as the old habit or identity, but in a healthier or more constructive way. And then there is capacity building, which is that you develop within yourself what you believed the old habit or behavior supplied. And the podcast episode that I had followed along with argues that simple suppression, organizing your attention around do not do this, can keep that old behavior, that old firing mechanism, hot, active, and under pressure. It essentially becomes stress and self-policing to stay away from it. And when you apply that kind of pressure and expectation to yourself, it can result in disappointment if you relapse, if you don't move away from that, which just continues to fuel a negative cycle for you. So, Mark Manson and his host present substitution and environmental design as more useful tools for change. And for me, Paint by the Numbers did not reproduce everything that THC gave me, but it did give my evening somewhere else to go. Some needs can be met differently, but some capacities have to be practiced until you no longer need to borrow them from the old behavior. And a replacement for an old behavior does not need to perfectly imitate the old reward system, whatever it was that the old habit or identity was giving you. It needs to help create a life in which the old response becomes less necessary. So, what belief had to break before the behavior could lose its hold? For THC, two stories mattered to me, which were I needed it to speak freely, and I needed it to cool down and decompress in the evening. That first story weakened through sober practice and accumulating real evidence and proof from public interactions and recording the podcast. The second story weakened quickly once I had an evening without it and discovered that rest, quiet, painting, watching Star Trek, and simply sitting around could bring me down from the day. I did not need THC to do that. And when I finally saw that I could just as much chill out sober as I could with THC, that hold broke more fully. In a weird way, it kind of became what I once heard Post Malone talk about in some of his interviews, which was that being sober became the new high. I will clarify and say that this did not occur in a single evening. And very, very often, a single moment does not permanently change every behavior. It usually requires repetition and continuing to show up in each moment, in each day. Behaviors remain powerful, partly because of the meanings and expectations surrounding them. The behavior becomes easier to release when the story keeping it in our lives, keeping it important and giving value to us, no longer matches what it is that we actually experience with that old habit, behavior, or cycle. Now, why is it that leaving THC behind felt different from earlier attempts to do other kinds of change, like changing my body and changing my fitness? For me, THC was something that I genuinely wanted to move away from because I no longer wanted the role it played in my life. But something like fitness was something that I had sometimes approached differently. Fitness had sometimes been approached differently. I had wanted to become more attractive for a future partner. I do date. I would like to find a partner one day, somebody who I'm able to openly and authentically connect with, and feel like we have a great connection and friendship. However, having that be a goal for fitness created this situation where the success of it depended on approval from a woman who did not yet exist in my life. My body essentially became a project meant to earn future acceptance, rather than something I could build and enjoy in the present. As a result, my motivation repeatedly collapsed because the reason for the change was external and hypothetical. What I genuinely want now, without that future need or expectation applying pressure or outsourcing success, is to have greater strength and endurance, a body that feels good to see and inhabit, and an appearance that I enjoy, appreciate, and reflects how I want to live. There is a difference between wanting to look good because I enjoy inhabiting that version of myself and trying to look good so that someone else will certify that I am worth choosing. Wanting to look attractive is not automatically unhealthy or inauthentic. The reason for change affects whether the work is personally meaningful enough to sustain. Growth pursued from genuine desire differs from growth pursued as an application for acceptance. What if there is no clean replacement, though? Does every old behavior have a healthier replacement? Honestly, the answer is no. Sometimes you're not going to find a clean or best replacement for any old habit or behavior you're dealing with. My personal example in this area is nicotine vapes. Stress can reactivate that desire because nicotine feels like a boost, a way to get moving, a rapid shift when I feel stuck or depleted. I'll be honest in saying that I have not identified a perfect alternative that recreates that immediate effect. Sometimes the task is not to find something healthier that provides the exact same reward. Sometimes the task is to decide that the reward is not worth the total cost. For me, when those urges come up now, I think about the costs of it. I think about the financial expense, the consequence for physical health, the way it interferes and misaligns me from the body and daily life I want to build, all for a short-term boost. What I have found, though, is awareness of that trade and awareness of the costs has been enough to keep me away from that. Like, I have better awareness of those negotiations, of those urges, and I'm better able to notice them and reject them in the moment. It's not perfect, nor does it always feel great in the moment. Sometimes change is not finding the same reward in a healthier package. Sometimes it is accepting that the immediate reward is not worth everything attached to it. We've talked about change in terms of old habits and behaviors, but what happens when the thing changing is an identity? Change is not always defeating something harmful. Sometimes it is thanking an old structure for what it did and recognizing that it no longer needs to organize your life. I went through a period where I had a strong symbolic identity around the person I believed I needed to become. It helped me organize difficult emotions, experiences, and reclaim parts of myself. Eventually, I realized I could keep what it taught me without continuing to live inside of that identity. An identity can help you survive one chapter and still become something you eventually need to release. That process can include grief, but releasing it does not mean it never helped you or did good for you. One of the things Mark Manson pointed out in his podcast is that there can be a gap between the old identity and the new identity, and that this is normal. That period between identities may feel empty or confusing, but it does not mean that you are doing anything wrong. I do want to take a moment, though, to state that not every difficult habit can be solved through reflection, routines, and hobbies. Serious substance dependence may require medical or professional support. Mental health conditions are not solved by simply choosing better routines. And depending on what you may be going through, as far as mental health situations, a different perspective or professional help is always important. I have had a therapist, and I've appreciated having a therapist. I've simply reached a point where a lot of the work that I need to do needs to occur of my own effort and with me putting in the work. Not every need has a clean substitute, and some changes involve discomfort that cannot be eliminated. Sometimes change is just going to feel uncomfortable. It happens. Some traits should be understood and accommodated rather than treated as defects. Your experience with change, your experience with these old habits, cycles, and patterns is an example, not a universal indictment. I am not saying that every difficult pattern disappears once you understand its function. I am saying that understanding the function helps you stop fighting the wrong problem. So, if you are looking to change something in your life, if you are looking to be different, what can you actually do? And really, there is a 4-step process that I was able to extract from this 5-hour podcast episode. So the first step is function. What job is the old behavior, habit, pattern, or identity performing. So, what does it give you as far as value? Is it comfort? So, if you remove it, what discomfort does it bring about? It's about identifying that reason, that it's there for you. As in, what value is it bringing for you? What purpose is it serving? The second step is story. So, what belief, story, reason, or expectation makes this old behavior feel necessary? So, is it that you feel like you need it to relax, that you cannot connect with other people without it, or that it just helps make things less difficult? It's about understanding why that habit, that pattern, that behavior is present in your life, of being open to the actual reason it's there for you. Step 3 is response. So, what could you do next? So, instead of going back to that old habit, that old behavior, what else could you go to? Is there a substitute, a new routine? Maybe it's just practicing the capacity sober or directly, or changing access to that habit or the environment that the habit is in. Maybe you just need to ask for help, have an accountability partner. Or maybe it could be accepting some hard truths, like accepting discomfort because the old reward is not worth its cost. The final step is support. What helps the new response survive stress? What is the structure and maintenance that allows that change to survive? Is it therapy? Is it a prepared routine? Is it reducing access to that old habit? Is it reminding yourself of the full cost of it? Is it being able to return to yourself after a lapse rather than declaring the change false? So do not ask only, how do I stop doing this? Ask, what job is it doing? What story keeps bringing it back? And what would help another response, a new identity, a different behavior survive? When I connect all of this back to the big example I had brought up for myself, which was THC, it wasn't until recently that I had noticed, while working on Paint by the Numbers, that I honestly could not remember the last time I had used THC. The date was no longer important to me. I was not measuring distance from the old behavior. I wasn't even thinking about urges or cravings or even wanting to go back to it. It just felt like living inside of a routine where it no longer felt necessary. The absence of it had become ordinary. And I think that really represents the essence of change itself, and something that I know was brought up in Mark Manson's episode. It was that change is not a dramatic conquest. You know, it's not something with a lot of fireworks or something that feels bold or explosive. It's often quiet. In this case, my change occurred because I understood the old role, what it was that THC was doing for me. I challenged the beliefs and perspectives surrounding it, and I practiced capacities and skills that I had previously outsourced. I built routines that supported another way of living, and now I'm applying that same framework imperfectly to unfinished changes. And that is okay that it is imperfect. What matters is the effort, the intention to show up. I do not know the exact day that any change that I'm working through becomes real. And maybe that is the point. Sometimes for me, things stopped feeling like a breakthrough. I had to measure and I had to analyze and understand because I was already in the life that I wanted to live. I was already living the way that I wanted to exist as. Change is less about defeating an old self than building a life in which a different response can keep living. And that is a wrap. And boy, oh boy, can I say that this was a challenge. This was a challenge to work through all of the reflection, and especially if you listened to the previous episode, you would know that this took a lot of effort to get through. But honestly, I appreciate that I did get through this. I was able to show to myself that I could work through tougher topics, ones that I could run into roadblocks and resistances with. And once again, that does not mean that the Mark Manson episode on change was bad. In fact, I thought it was pretty great. There was a lot of value that I got out of it. And I will be including a link to it in my episode description so that if you do want to check it out, you can go listen to it for yourself. Maybe you'll come to a different takeaway than I did. Maybe you'll walk away with some different insight and wisdom than I. And that's okay. My plan for the next batch of episodes, since I don't have any recommendations or questions lined up, is that I feel like with these first 5 episodes I've recorded, that I've been showing a lot my process on how I change, how I approach things, and how I learn. But I do want to get into showing how I perceive things, being able to show my perspective, and being able to explore some different topics, some of the books that I've read, being able to explore some spiritual topics even. I have something that I created involving the chakra system that I'm pretty excited to show off. With that, it's mainly, once again, what resonated with me and also creating something new from it that I'm excited to work through. But that is a topic for a future episode. If you enjoyed this and you've been enjoying the podcast, however many episodes you've been listening, I would really appreciate a follow on whatever platform you're listening in on, as well as a podcast review, and maybe even leave a comment or two. All of that helps the podcast to grow, reach more people, and just helps the overall success of it. And I do always appreciate hearing from people. If you would like to leave a recommendation, something that you'd like me to explore or cover in the podcast, or you want to send me a message or some feedback, there is a link to the feedback form in the description of this podcast, also available on my website. And you can also find a link to the website in the description of the episode. With all of that said, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I hope to have you back here with the podcast soon. Bye.